Level 1. The Last Sighting. At 10:47 on a cold Tuesday night, a man named Daniel Mercer walked out of a small gas station on the edge of the city. A security camera captured him buying a bottle of water. Nothing unusual. He wasn't running. He wasn't being followed. He simply walked to an older silver sedan parked near the road, got inside, and drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Daniel. By the following morning, his apartment was empty. His phone was turned off. His car was gone. And the people who knew him couldn't explain where he had gone. Daniel wasn't a famous criminal. He wasn't someone who normally attracted attention. He worked as a maintenance supervisor for a private construction company and lived a quiet life. But 3 days earlier, Daniel had witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. He had been working late at a construction site when he noticed a vehicle entering the property after midnight. The vehicle didn't belong there. Daniel watched from a distance. He saw two men carrying several sealed containers into an unfinished building. He didn't know what was inside them, but he remembered the vehicle, and he remembered one of the men. The next morning, Daniel reported what he had seen. He thought the matter would end there. It didn't. 2 days later, investigators contacted him again. They wanted to ask more questions. Daniel agreed, but before that interview could happen, he disappeared. At first, investigators thought he might simply have left town. Then they discovered something strange. Daniel had withdrawn cash shortly before leaving. He had also contacted someone he hadn't spoken to in almost 6 years. A former co-worker named Marcus Bell. Marcus told investigators that Daniel had sounded nervous, but he claimed he had no idea where Daniel was going. Then they looked at Daniel's old addresses, his previous employer, his relatives, his former roommates, his friends. At first, none of it seemed connected. Daniel appeared to have disappeared without leaving much behind. But investigators knew something Daniel didn't. People rarely disappear completely. They leave relationships behind. Old addresses, old habits, old conversations, and sometimes one person remembers something everyone else forgot. 3 days after Daniel disappeared, investigators received their first unexpected tip. It came from someone who hadn't spoken to Daniel in years, and what that person said changed the direction of the entire investigation. Level 2. The file opens. The tip came in at 8:16 on a Friday morning. The caller was a woman named Laura Bennett. She had worked with Daniel Mercer almost 7 years earlier at a property maintenance company. According to Laura, Daniel had always been predictable. He arrived early. He took the same route to work. He ate lunch at the same small diner. And whenever something bothered him, he became unusually quiet. But there was one thing Laura remembered that investigators found interesting. Daniel had once told her that he never trusted people who changed their routines without a reason. At the time, it had sounded like an ordinary comment. Now, it didn't. Laura told investigators that 3 days before Daniel disappeared, he had contacted her unexpectedly. She hadn't heard his voice in years. Daniel didn't ask about her family. He didn't ask about work. He asked one strange question. Do you still have the old company contact list? Laura didn't understand why he wanted it. She told him she had deleted most of her old records. Daniel simply said, "If you still have anything, don't throw it away." Then he ended the call. Laura hadn't thought much about it until she heard that Daniel was missing. That's when she searched through an old box in her garage. Inside were several papers from her former workplace. Most were outdated, some were invoices, some were employee records, and one was an old emergency contact sheet. Laura almost threw it away. Then she noticed a name. Marcus Bell. The same former co-worker Daniel had contacted shortly before disappearing. Investigators asked Laura whether Marcus and Daniel had been close. She said no. In fact, they had barely spoken after leaving the company. That raised another question. Why would Daniel contact Marcus after nearly 6 years? Investigators pulled Marcus's employment records. They discovered something unexpected. Marcus hadn't simply been a former co-worker. He had worked on several construction projects connected to the same company Daniel was currently working for. And one of those projects had taken place near the construction site, where Daniel claimed he had seen the suspicious vehicle. That connection wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was enough to keep investigators digging. They interviewed Marcus again. This time, they asked him about Daniel's phone call. Marcus admitted Daniel had contacted him, but he insisted the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. According to Marcus, Daniel had asked whether he still remembered an old storage facility they had used years earlier. Marcus said he didn't, but investigators noticed something. When they mentioned the facility's name, Marcus paused. It was only for a moment. A small hesitation, but investigators wrote it down because investigations are often built on details that seem meaningless at first. They checked the storage facility. Daniel had never rented a unit there. Marcus hadn't either. At least, not under his own name. Then investigators found an old company payment record. 6 years earlier, someone from Marcus's department had paid for a storage unit at that exact location. The payment had been made in cash. The name on the record was incomplete. Only 3 letters were visible. Morar. Investigators couldn't prove it was Marcus, but now they had something else. A location, a name, and a 6-year-old connection that Daniel had suddenly remembered just before he disappeared. The investigation was no longer about where Daniel had gone. It was becoming a question of why he had gone there in the first place. And then investigators discovered something even more disturbing. The storage facility had security footage, but the footage from the week Daniel disappeared was missing. Someone had requested it to be deleted, and that request had been made before Daniel vanished. Level 3. The people he left behind. The missing security footage changed the investigation. Until that moment, Daniel's disappearance could still be explained as a man leaving town voluntarily. Now there was a question investigators couldn't ignore. Who knew Daniel was going to disappear? And who had reason to erase the evidence connected to him? Investigators began working backward through Daniel's life. Not his phone, not his bank account, his relationships. The people who had known him before anyone considered him a missing person. The first was his former neighbor, Harold Price. Harold had lived across the hallway from Daniel for almost 4 years. He remembered Daniel as quiet. Daniel rarely had visitors. He usually left for work before 8 in the morning and returned around 6. But Harold remembered one unusual change. About a week before Daniel disappeared, someone had started visiting him late at night. It wasn't always the same time. Sometimes shortly after midnight. Sometimes closer to 2 in the morning. Harold never saw the visitor's face clearly. But he remembered the sound of the vehicle, an older silver sedan. Investigators asked him whether it was Daniel's car. Harold said no. Daniel's sedan had a different engine sound. This vehicle was older, and it usually stopped outside the building for less than 10 minutes. Then it would leave. Harold couldn't provide a license plate, but he remembered something else. The driver never used Daniel's apartment entrance. Instead, the person would wait near the side staircase. That detail seemed insignificant until investigators learned that the side staircase wasn't covered by the building's main security camera. Someone could enter and leave without appearing on the footage. Investigators then spoke with Daniel's cousin, Rebecca Mercer. She said Daniel had become increasingly cautious during the final week before he disappeared. He had stopped answering calls. He had canceled a planned family dinner. And according to Rebecca, he had asked her a strange question. If someone wanted to disappear for a while, where would they go? She assumed he was joking. She told him he would probably go somewhere quiet. Daniel smiled. Then he asked, "What if they already knew where you would look?" Rebecca remembered that sentence clearly. At the time, she thought Daniel was talking about someone else. Now investigators wondered if he had been talking about himself. Then came the third person, a former roommate named Kevin Shaw. Kevin hadn't spoken to Daniel in nearly 5 years. But when investigators showed him a photograph of Marcus Bell, Kevin immediately recognized him. Not from work, from somewhere else. Kevin said Marcus had once visited their apartment when Daniel and Kevin were still roommates. The visit had happened late at night. Marcus had brought a small envelope. Kevin didn't know what was inside, but he remembered Daniel refusing to accept it. The two men argued quietly in the hallway. Kevin couldn't hear everything, but he remembered Daniel saying one sentence. "You said this was finished." That sentence changed everything. Because if Kevin's memory was correct, Marcus and Daniel had been connected long before the phone call 6 years later. Investigators asked Kevin why he had never mentioned this before. His answer was simple. He had forgotten. Or at least, he thought he had. But now the investigators had 3 separate pieces of information. A mysterious visitor, a warning about disappearing, and an old argument involving Marcus Bell. None of them proved a crime. None of them explained where Daniel had gone. But when investigators placed the information on a timeline, something strange appeared. The late-night visits to Daniel's apartment had started exactly 1 week before the suspicious vehicle was seen at the construction site. And the last visit happened less than 24 hours before Daniel disappeared. Investigators returned to Harold Price. They showed him several photographs of different vehicles. He studied them carefully. Then he pointed to one, the older silver sedan, the same model Daniel had been seen driving on the night he disappeared. But Harold immediately noticed something investigators hadn't. The car had a small dent above the rear wheel. Daniel's car didn't have that dent, which meant the vehicle visiting Daniel's apartment and the vehicle Daniel drove away in might not have been the same car. Someone else may have been using an almost identical vehicle, and suddenly, Daniel's disappearance looked less like an impulsive decision. It looked planned. The question was, who had planned it? Level 4. One connection remains. By the 4th day of the investigation, Daniel Mercer was no longer simply a missing person. His disappearance had become a pattern, a suspicious vehicle, a missing security recording, an old connection to Marcus Bell, late-night visitors, and a conversation that seemed to have been forgotten for years. But investigators still had one problem. They couldn't connect any of it directly. There was no clear witness, no obvious suspect, and no evidence showing where Daniel had gone, so they returned to the people Daniel had known, not the people closest to him, the people he had almost forgotten. One name appeared repeatedly in old records: Samuel Ortiz. Samuel had worked with Daniel at the same construction company more than a decade earlier. He had left the company long before Daniel disappeared. Investigators initially considered him irrelevant. Then they discovered something unusual. Samuel had once managed a small equipment warehouse. That warehouse was located less than 3 miles from the construction site where Daniel had seen the suspicious vehicle. Investigators visited Samuel. He was cooperative. He told them he hadn't spoken to Daniel in years. But when investigators mentioned the construction site, his expression changed. Samuel admitted Daniel had contacted him about 2 weeks before disappearing. Daniel had asked whether Samuel still had access to the old warehouse records. Samuel said he didn't understand why. Daniel never explained. He simply asked one more question. "Do you remember who used to pick up the after-hours deliveries?" Samuel thought for a moment. Then he gave investigators a name: Marcus Bell. That was the first direct connection. But Samuel added something else. Marcus hadn't been the only person making those deliveries. There had been another employee, a man named Elliot Crane. Elliot had worked in logistics. He handled vehicle schedules and delivery paperwork. According to Samuel, Elliot was extremely organized. He remembered every vehicle, every route, every delivery time, and every person who had access to the warehouse. Investigators searched the old company records. Elliot Crane had left the company 6 years earlier, exactly when Daniel and Marcus stopped working together. That coincidence caught their attention. They searched for Elliot. He was still alive, still living in the same state. And according to public records, he had recently started working for a private transportation company. Investigators contacted him. Elliot remembered Daniel immediately. But when asked about Marcus, he became cautious. He said they had worked together, nothing more. Then investigators showed him a photograph of the silver sedan seen near Daniel's apartment. Elliot stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then he said something investigators hadn't expected. "I've seen that car before." He couldn't remember the license plate, but he remembered the distinctive dent above the rear wheel, the same dent Harold had described. Investigators asked where he had seen it. Elliot didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked them a question. "Did Daniel tell you about the storage facility?" The investigators exchanged looks. They hadn't mentioned the storage facility. Elliot had somehow known about it. When pressed, Elliot finally explained. 6 years earlier, Marcus had rented a storage unit using cash, but the unit wasn't used to store company equipment. It contained old delivery records, records that had never been supposed to leave the warehouse. Elliot claimed he had never opened the files, but he remembered one thing. Daniel had discovered the missing records. And after that, Marcus and Daniel had a serious argument, the same argument Kevin had remembered. "You said this was finished." For the first time, the investigators had a possible explanation for the strange connection between Daniel and Marcus. But there was still one question. Why would Daniel suddenly become interested in something that happened 6 years ago? Elliot gave them an answer. 3 days before Daniel disappeared, someone had contacted him. Someone asking questions about the old records. Someone who apparently believed those records still existed. Investigators asked Elliot for the person's name. He didn't know it, but he remembered the number. It was an old company number, a number that had been disconnected years ago. Investigators traced it anyway, and what they found shocked them. The number had been reactivated only once. 2 days before Daniel disappeared, someone had brought an old identity back to life. And whoever had done it was looking for the same thing Daniel had been looking for. The old records. Level 5, the old routine. The investigation had reached a turning point. For 6 years, the old records had appeared to be nothing more than forgotten paperwork. Now investigators had reason to believe someone was searching for them. And Daniel had apparently started searching too. The question was, why? Investigators went back through Daniel's final week. They reconstructed his movements using receipts, workplace records, witness statements, and old routines. There was something unusual. Daniel had not behaved like a man preparing to disappear. He had behaved like a man trying to find something. On Monday morning, he arrived at work earlier than usual. He spent almost 40 minutes inside the company's records room. A coworker remembered seeing him going through old project files. Daniel normally hated paperwork, but that morning he seemed focused. He asked for records from 6 years earlier. Then he asked about a project that had been officially closed. The project had a simple name: Riverside Warehouse Renovation. Nothing about it appeared suspicious. The company had completed the renovation. The property had been sold. The paperwork had been archived. But one detail didn't match. The final delivery report listed 12 containers entering the property. The warehouse's internal records listed only 9. 3 containers were missing. Investigators checked the original paperwork. The missing entries had been removed from a copy of the report, but someone had handwritten the original numbers on the back of another page. The handwriting belonged to Daniel. That meant Daniel had already discovered the discrepancy before he disappeared. Investigators then examined his movements over the next 2 days. On Tuesday, Daniel visited the old storage facility. He didn't enter. He parked across the street for approximately 11 minutes. Then he left. A camera from a nearby business captured the vehicle. But Daniel wasn't alone. Another car stopped several minutes after he arrived. The same older silver sedan, the one with the dent above the rear wheel. Daniel appeared to notice it. He immediately drove away. That evening, Daniel contacted Marcus Bell. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Then, according to phone records, Daniel made another call. This one was to Samuel Ortiz. Samuel didn't answer. Daniel left no voicemail. Wednesday morning, Daniel returned to work. A coworker noticed something strange. Daniel had printed an old delivery schedule. He folded the paper and placed it inside his jacket. Later that afternoon, he received an envelope. No return address, no name. Just Daniel's apartment number written on the front. He opened it at work. Whatever he saw inside apparently disturbed him. He left the building early. That evening, Daniel went home. At 11:38 p.m., the silver sedan appeared outside his apartment. At 11:46, someone entered the building through the side staircase. At 11:53, the person left. Daniel remained inside. The next morning, he didn't go to work. Instead, he withdrew cash from a bank several miles away. Then, he drove toward the edge of the city. At 10:47 that night, the gas station camera captured him for the final time. Investigators now understood something important. Daniel hadn't suddenly decided to disappear. He had been following a routine connected to the old warehouse project, the storage facility, the missing records, and the silver sedan. But there was still one unexplained detail. What had been inside the envelope? Investigators searched Daniel's apartment again. They found no envelope, no letter, no photograph, nothing. Then Rebecca, Daniel's cousin, remembered something. The night before Daniel disappeared, he had called her. The conversation lasted less than a minute. She had forgotten about it until investigators asked about Daniel's final day. Rebecca said Daniel sounded calm, almost too calm. Before ending the call, he told her something strange. "If anyone asks, I never told you about the old house." Rebecca had no idea what he meant. There was no old house, at least not one she knew about. Investigators checked Daniel's family history. They found an address, a small house outside the city. Daniel's father had owned it decades earlier. The property had been abandoned for years, and according to county records, someone had recently started paying the property taxes. The payments began exactly 2 months before Daniel disappeared. Investigators drove there the next morning. The house looked empty, but the front door wasn't locked. Inside, there was almost nothing. One table, 2 chairs, an old lamp, and a dusty wooden cabinet. Investigators opened the cabinet. Inside was a single cardboard box. On the box was a handwritten label. 3 words, Riverside, 2019. The same year the missing records disappeared, and beneath the label was Daniel's handwriting. Level 6. He was never really gone. The box marked Riverside, 2019 contained no money, no weapon, no secret photographs, just documents, old delivery schedules, copies of warehouse invoices, vehicle registration records, and 3 handwritten pages. Investigators immediately recognized the handwriting. Daniel had written them. The first page contained a list of 12 containers. The second showed the same 12 containers crossing through the Riverside warehouse, but the company's official records showed only 9. The final page contained 3 names: Marcus Bell, Elliot Crane, and a third name investigators had never seen before: Victor Hale. Victor had been the regional manager overseeing the Riverside project in 2019. He had left the company shortly after the project was completed. Investigators searched his records. They discovered that Victor had authorized the original delivery schedule. He had also approved the corrected version that showed only 9 containers. That explained the missing records. But it didn't explain Daniel's disappearance. Then, investigators found something written at the bottom of Daniel's final page. A sentence that changed the entire case. "If they think I'm gone, they'll stop looking for the evidence." Investigators read it again. Daniel hadn't disappeared because he was running from the people involved. He had disappeared because he wanted them to believe he had. The next clue was hidden in the old house. Behind the wooden cabinet was a loose section of wall. Inside was a small envelope. It contained photographs of the Riverside warehouse taken 6 years earlier. In several photographs, the same 12 containers could be seen. 3 of them had never appeared in the official records. And in one photograph, investigators recognized the silver sedan. The vehicle belonged to Victor Hale. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. 6 years earlier, 3 containers had been moved through the Riverside project without appearing in the final records. Marcus had helped coordinate the deliveries. Elliot had handled transportation paperwork. Victor had approved the altered records. Daniel had discovered the discrepancy years later. But he hadn't had enough evidence to prove what happened. Then, while working at another construction site, Daniel saw the same vehicle again. That was when he realized the people involved might still be connected. He reported what he had seen. Then he began quietly collecting evidence. The old storage facility, the missing records, the photographs, the old house. Everything had been part of Daniel's plan. But there was one problem. Someone realized what he was doing. The late-night visits began. The anonymous envelope arrived. The old company number was reactivated, and Daniel understood that someone was searching for the same evidence. So he created a disappearance. He withdrew cash. He turned off his phone. He drove away in his own car. And at the gas station, he deliberately allowed the security camera to capture him. It created the impression that he had simply left, but he hadn't. His real destination was the old family property. From there, he contacted an investigator using a public computer and provided copies of the evidence. He never used his own phone. He never returned to his apartment. And he never contacted the people who might have been watching him. For several days, investigators believed Daniel was missing. In reality, he had been waiting to see who would move once they believed he was gone. And someone did. Victor Hale attempted to access the old storage facility. Security cameras captured him entering the property. Marcus Bell arrived less than an hour later. Both men were questioned. Neither initially admitted anything. But investigators now had the records, the photographs, the vehicle evidence, and Daniel's written notes. Eventually, the old Riverside operation came back into focus. The 3 missing containers had been deliberately removed from the official paperwork. The investigation uncovered years of falsified records and concealed transactions connected to the project. Marcus and Victor were eventually arrested in connection with the investigation. Elliot cooperated with investigators and provided additional records. But there was still one person everyone wanted to find: Daniel Mercer. 6 days after the investigation began, an investigator received a message. There was no sender name, only a photograph. It showed Daniel sitting inside a quiet roadside cafe, alive, safe, and watching the news coverage of his own disappearance. Under the photograph was a single sentence: "Now you know why I had to disappear." Investigators arranged a meeting. Daniel finally returned. He explained that he hadn't trusted anyone until he knew the evidence was secure. He hadn't wanted to become another missing piece of the investigation. He wanted the truth to survive, even if he didn't. And that was the final lesson of the case. Daniel had never really disappeared. He had simply stepped out of the story long enough to see who would reveal themselves. The investigators had started with one missing man. Then they followed his relationships, his routines, his old workplace, his forgotten connections. And eventually, the trail led back 6 years. Not because Daniel left behind one perfect clue, but because he had left behind many small ones. Each person remembered something different. Each record revealed something small. And when those pieces were finally placed together, the disappearance stopped looking like a mystery. It became a map. A map leading back to the truth. Daniel Mercer was never really gone. He was waiting for the truth to catch up with him. The end.